Equity Voice by Equity Lab สถาบันวิจัยเพื่อความเสมอภาคทางการศึกษา www.research.eef.or.th สวัสดีครับยินดีต้อนรับสู่ Equity Voice Podcast เพื่อความเสมอภาคทางการศึกษานะครับเราจะหาประเด็นที่เกิดขึ้นรอบตัวบันทึกการสนทนาเพื่อทำให้เรื่องราวความเหลื่อมล้ำทางการศึกษาถูกพูดถึงและแก้ไขวันนี้ผมโกวิท โพธิสารดำเนินรายการนะครับเรามีบทสนทนากับคุณพอล คอลลาร์ดผู้ก่อตั้ง Creativity Culture and Education หรือ CCE องค์กรที่มีจุดประสงค์เพื่อพัฒนาความคิดสร้างสรรค์ของเด็กและเยาวชนมาฝากกันครับหลังจากที่คุณพอลได้ร่วมงานกับรัฐบาลอังกฤษภายใต้โครงการ Creative Partnerships โดยรัฐบาลอังกฤษขณะนั้นเล็งเห็นว่าอุตสาหกรรมเชิงสร้างสรรค์ถือเป็นอุตสาหกรรมหลักในการขับเคลื่อนเศรษฐกิจแต่เมื่อมีการเปลี่ยนผ่านของรัฐบาลเงินสนับสนุนโครงการจึงถูกยกเลิกไปนะครับแต่ถึงอย่างนั้นคุณพอลก็ไม่ล้มเลิกความคิดที่จะพัฒนาการเรียนรู้ของเด็กซึ่งไม่ใช่แค่เด็กในประเทศเท่านั้นนะครับแต่รวมถึงประเทศอื่นๆทั่วโลกด้วยจากการทำงานและประสบการณ์เขาพบว่าการจะมีความคิดสร้างสรรค์ได้นั้นเด็กต้องมี5ลักษณะนิสัยพื้นฐานคือ 1. อยากรู้อยากเห็น 2. มีความอดทน 3. มีจินตนาการ 4. มีวินัยและข้อ 5 คือการมีส่วนร่วมนะครับเมื่อรวมพฤติกรรมเหล่านี้เข้าด้วยกันจึงเกิดเป็นนิยามของคำว่าสร้างสรรค์ที่ควรมีในโรงเรียนประเทศไทยเนี่ยก็ถือเป็นหนึ่งในประเทศเป้าหมายที่คุณพอสนใจร่วมงานด้วยนะครับเพราะมีองค์กรอย่างกองทุนเพื่อความเสมอภาคทางการศึกษาหรือกสศซึ่งเป็นองค์กรที่มีแนวคิดเดียวกับ CCE ในการลดความเหลื่อมล้ำทางการศึกษาและพัฒนาการเรียนรู้ของเด็กที่มีฐานะยากจนให้ดีขึ้นบทสัมภาษณ์ชิ้นนี้คุณทันชนก สินอนันต์จินดาและคุณนิชการภักดีทีมคอนเทนต์ของเราไปคุยกับคุณพอล คอลลาร์ดเพื่อสำรวจแง่มุมในการสร้าง5ลักษณะนิสัยอันจะนำไปสู่การพัฒนาความคิดสร้างสรรค์และตอบคำถามว่าทำไม CCE จึงหยิบประเด็นความคิดสร้างสรรค์มาแก้โจทย์ในการพัฒนาการเรียนรู้ของเด็กรวมไปถึงเปลี่ยนวิกฤตโควิด -19 เป็นโอกาสทางการศึกษาได้อย่างไรแต่ต้องแจ้งคุณผู้ฟังก่อนนะครับนี่คือบทสนทนาภาษาอังกฤษนะครับถ้าต้องการอ่านเวอร์ชันภาษาไทยก็สามารถเข้าไปดูได้ที่เว็บไซต์ research.eef.or.th ซึ่งเราจะแปะลิงก์ไว้ที่ description นะครับถ้าพร้อมแล้วก็เชิญรับฟังบทสนทนากับคุณพอล คอลลาร์ดครับ
So we would like to know something about education and something that we don't really know how to develop education. So we need to ask your from experience and something like that. So we want to know how do you work with educational in around the world like that. Okay. So could you please introduce yourself?
So my name's Paul Collard. I come from an organisation based in England called Creativity, Culture and Education. The organisation was set up originally to run a big programme in schools in England called Creative Partnerships, and this was a big national government initiative. And we worked with many schools. We worked with about 2,500 schools every year. Of course, in Thai terms, that's a very small number of schools because you have huge numbers of schools here in Thailand. And after about 10 years, the UK government decided to take our funding away because there'd been a general election and a change of government and so forth. And then we just decided we'd work in other countries in the world. And since then, we've worked a lot around Europe and then beyond that to places like Pakistan and India and Thailand and Australia and Chile and Peru and so forth. And it's much more fun than working in England.
I would like to know that what's the start point that you want to work with education? What do you see? What's the problem of education like that?
So we were set up originally by the British government to develop the creativity of children and young people in formal education in England. And the UK government at that time was very interested in this. because they saw the creative industries defined very broadly to include music, theatre, the arts, poetry, but also publishing, television, filmmaking, fashion, design, architecture, and so forth, as being the future driver of the UK economy. And if the creative industries were going to drive the UK economy, then it needed lots of creative people, and therefore schools had to become focused on developing more creative people so this could grow as part of the economy. And it has grown and is the fastest growing sector of the British economy. It creates the most new jobs, it creates the best paid jobs, and it creates the most fun jobs. And therefore, this is the sector everybody wants to work in. But as we worked in creativity, we came to understand that really creativity is about learning. Now, this is partly because when the British government told us to develop creativity in children and young people, we said, yes, we'd love to do that. By the way, what is creativity? And the British government said, we have no idea. Could you please find out? Because we'd like to know. So we commissioned research to help us understand what is creativity. And creativity has become a big industry in universities around the world. There are professors of creativity in lots of countries, and they all publish books on creativity, and the books are all very big, and what they all have in common is they're impossible to understand. And we said to some researchers at Winchester University, we would like you to come up with a definition of creativity that is useful in schools and that we can all understand, because nobody's going to be developing creativity if you need a PhD to know what it is, because teachers and children need to know what it is if they're going to develop it. So they came up with a definition of creativity which is based on the 5 creative habits of mind, which are being curious, being resilient or persistent, being imaginative, being disciplined, and being collaborative. And it's these combinations of behaviours which to us define creativity, and certainly the kind of creativity that you should be finding in school. And we went to talk to teachers about it and said, we're here to develop creativity. And they said, oh good, what's that? And we said, oh, well, it's curiosity, resilience, imagination, discipline, and collaboration. Do you like that? And teachers said to us, well, we don't know if that's a definition of creativity, but what we do know is that children need to be curious, resilient, imaginative, disciplined, and collaborative before they can start learning. So if you're here to help us develop these skills in young people, then we're very pleased to see you. And that's what we focused on. And what we came to understand is that these skills are at the heart of learning. This is how you learn. There's lots of different ways of explaining this, but one famous educationalist said, to learn something, you must first burn it on the imagination before you can analyze it with reason. And that's really true of things like maths. Everybody thinks maths is very logical. But in fact, if you're going to be good at maths, you have to be able to see maths. And what's see maths? What do you mean by see maths? Well, you have to imagine it. You have to see it in your mind. I loved maths when I was little because I found maths really easy. And the reason I found maths really easy is because I could see it. I could imagine it. I didn't need to learn my times table because I could see that 5 times 5 was 25. It's obvious. So imagination is how you see maths. And if you can't see maths, you can't learn maths. And therefore imagination is at the heart of it. And so we became to understand that these skills are what learning consists of. And so our work really became more about learning. And after we stopped working in England and started working in the rest of the world, it gave us the opportunity to travel to lots of different places and see children and young people in schools in lots of different places. And what we came to realize is that whilst teaching changes from country to country and is different in different cultures, learning is always the same. Learning is this magical thing that human beings have discovered. Almost nothing else in nature can learn. They certainly can't learn like we learn. We just learn unbelievably. And it's a fabulous creative experience, learning. And to have successful lives, we need to go on learning for the rest of our lives. And therefore, our programs are about how to develop not only the capacity, but a love for learning in all young people. Because if they have that, they will have rich and wonderful lives.
So as you said before, like students or pupils need to have like 5 skills.
Yeah.
Yep. So I would like to know that how CCE, creativity, culture, education, how do they work with those skills and how to make students reach the point that you want students to be at that point.
Absolutely.
So I would like to know how you work with students with all these skills.
Absolutely. After we commissioned all this research to establish what we meant by creativity, we then spoke to lots of teachers and other educationalists and said, right, we want you to go into the classroom and develop these skills in children and young people. And they said, how should we do that? And we said, that's your job. Go and find out how to do this. We will come and watch you. But what you need to focus on is developing these skills. So think about it. So we started lots of programs. We sent lots of people into schools. They worked with children and young people. We sent lots of researchers in to observe them. And we discovered from this process that there is a learning environment which naturally develops these skills in children and young people. And how we went around doing that is we talked to teachers about what were the most profound learning experiences in their lives. They said, tell us some great learning that happened in your life. And they'd tell us stories about that. And we would go, so from that, what does it tell you about learning? And they'd think about this and they said, well, it tells me that great learning takes place when you're not given the answer, but you're made to go and find the answer for yourself. Great learning takes place in a social environment when people are working collaboratively and socially. Great learning happens when it's authentic, when it's about real life. It's not about some abstract concept, but it's about things in my life. Great learning takes place when I'm physically engaged. Great learning is emotional and has emotions connected with it. And great learning happens when it's driven by my questions and my experiences of life. And we said, that's wonderful, that's great learning. And we said, yes. And so I said, so given that's great learning and your job's to make sure great learning happens, I assume that that's what you do in class. And they said, well, no, we don't do that in class, we teach the curriculum. And we said, well, stop teaching the curriculum, do that. If that's great learning, do that. Go into classes and do that. And they went into classes and learnt how to deliver the curriculum, but in ways which were like that, which had the characteristics of great learning. And when they started to do that, the children started to change. And firstly, we were aware they became much more engaged. They were interested in their learning. When teachers constructed learning on that model of great learning. Secondly, they turned up much more often. They were absent much less. They didn't drop out from school anymore because they were engaged and they were interested, they were enjoying this. And of course, if kids are in school, they're going to make more progress than if they're not in school, aren't they? And so just because these programs made children be in school more, that improved the quality of their learning. The relations between pupils in class and between the pupils and the teacher got better. And that helped the learning. I remember talking to a 16-year-old boy once, and we were talking about a subject. I said, "Are you good at that subject?" He said, "No." And I said, "Why not?" He said, "I don't like anybody in that class." That's the reality. If you're in a class you don't like anybody, you don't learn. And it's true. But if you build that relationship, so you get on with them, then you learn. So they put all these characteristics in place. They made learning much more emotional, and they engaged the emotions, but they were also much more honest about the emotions and so forth. And the more they did this, the better the learning happened in the school. And the more that the children's creativity, as being curious, resilient, imaginative, disciplined and collaborative, improved.
There are many students who offer good education, and I wonder how we develop our fast skill of behavior in those students.
In those students who are doing well in education.
Yes, who of the opportunity to in a good education.
Yes. I think these characteristics that we talk about, one of the things that we know from research is that young people from more affluent, from richer backgrounds, tend to have these skills more developed when they arrive in school. And this tells us something about how these skills are developed. And it's about the quality of your relationship with the adults around you. This has a very big impact. And in particular, research suggests that it's the quality of the conversation that you have that really develops these characteristics and these behaviors in children and young people.
Could you give more an example that what is quality of conversation?
What the research indicates is that it takes place in the language that adults and children share. And the researchers divide language into what they call administrative language and discursive language. Administrative language is go to bed, eat your food, go to school, put your clothes on. It's just orders. Discursive language is much more complex and ambiguous and is about exploring the world, talking to children about how the sunlight falls through the leaves onto the ground and what that makes you feel. Of using more complex words, of talking about relationships and love and all those sort of things. And this being normal part of your discussion from very early on in the life. What these researchers argue is that on the whole, children from poorer backgrounds get less adult interaction. In the meeting that we were just having, we were talking about the fact that in poorer communities, almost 50% of families have only one parent or no parents involved. And if you've got several children, you're the only parent, you don't have time for discussing the sun coming through the leaves. You only have time for saying, eat your tea, eat your food, go to bed, and so on and so forth. And it restricts the quality of those linguistic interactions. I've sat in museums watching parents come round with small children and looking at things and talking about what they may be and analysing them. And that conversation is of huge importance to the development of children. It's not saying, this is a flower. It's, what do you think this is? And how do you think it works? And what colour would you call that? And so on and so forth. And that's all the stuff that's stimulating the brain of the child constantly. But in a social context, and in a physical context, you're wandering around this museum. So you're exploring spaces and so forth. And you're doing it as a family, building family memories and so forth. And ultimately, a family is only its memories. It's the things you did together. That's being a family. And if you have lots of rich experiences of things you did together, went out and walked in the forest, went to the beach, swam in the sea, so on and so forth, had all this range of experiences as a family, those create family. Those things are what being a family is, and so forth. And those things really stimulate those characteristics we're talking about: imagination, curiosity, collaboration, and so forth. So the challenge for schools, if you're dealing with young people who've not had those experiences, is you have to replicate them. And therefore, the learning experience has to be that way of learning you didn't get, if you see what I mean. And therefore has to be exploratory, discursive, thought-provoking, and so forth. And not simply telling people a whole lot of facts and telling them to remember it. That's not going to help them develop their brains.
Okay, so from your experience, how many educational processes in the world that you face on like that? So how many processes of education?
Well, there's millions of ways of educating children and young people. Most education systems, though, have a fairly narrow concept, which is we'll give the children lots of knowledge, we'll make them learn it off by heart, and we'll then give them multiple answer exams and to find out if they remembered what I said to them. And that's the core concept of education in many systems around the world. And it's a very poor concept of education. And I think even teachers doing it know that it's not really realizing the full potential of children. But there are techniques for being good at multiple answer exams, and they focus on delivering those. And it's a shame. What children should be exposed to is lots and lots of different ways of learning. And the approach to education which CCE takes is one based on encouraging diversity in the classroom. Do something different tomorrow from what you did yesterday. Challenge the children harder in terms of what you ask of them constantly. And that requires you as a teacher to be inventive. A lot of teachers want you simply to give them lesson plans. Go teach them that. And we go, no, you've got to invent the lesson plans with the children. But you've got to do this together. But it's the diversity of the approaches is the most important part of that. Krayot, who is the deputy director here, expressed our approach very well the other day when he said the problem is that people want your approach to education to be an alternative singularity, by which he means that people like to think there's a system for education, and then we come along and go, no, here's a new system. And everyone learns that system, and then life is fun, and everything goes well. And in fact, we're going, no, there are hundreds of different systems, and the more you as a teacher are able to use, the better your teaching will be. There's not a system. It's the richness and the diversity is the most important. So there are many, many ways of teaching and learning out there, which is great. Most teachers don't use enough of them. And our job is to try and give them far more opportunities.
Among diversity of learning, the way of learning or teaching, something like that. Should we have a discipline among diversity?
Yes, because discipline, in our sense, actually means self-discipline. A lot of schools focus on teaching children discipline, by which they say, we've taught children to do exactly what I say. And that's not self-discipline to me. And what you need to do is to develop self-discipline. When you apply self-discipline in any real sense in the classroom, you will get diversity of outcomes. So last weekend, we were doing an online workshop for Thai teachers. And at the end of 2.5 days of this workshop, we did an activity called I Now Know. And we asked the teachers to think of 5 sentences which start I now know as a reflection on the workshop for 2.5 days. So what do you now know which you didn't know before the workshop? 5 things. And then we went round everybody, and everybody had to tell us what their 5 I now knows were. And there were 35 teachers, and they each had 5, and almost all of them were different. So that was 155 learnings which were different. Now, to me, that proves the point. Every one of those teachers are at a different point in their development as teachers. Some were quite new, some were more experienced, some worked in rural schools, some worked in city schools, some worked in big schools, some worked in small schools. But all of them had different learning needs. So I did a workshop which explored various ideas in learning, and they all learnt different things because they learnt what they needed to learn, which is what I needed to teach them. And because they're all different, it was all different, if you see what I mean. And teachers need to think of lessons in the same way. I'm teaching something, but each child needs to learn what they need to learn. And children are different. Some are really smart, some are not so smart. Some have parents who talk to them about maths all the time. Others have never talked about maths and so forth. And therefore, if I'm teaching them a maths thing, they will learn different things. And that's right, because that's what they ought to do. And they need the self-discipline to extract from the class the learning they need. That's the skill that children need to develop. And it's self-discipline which gives them that. So self-discipline will give them diversity of learning, and that's what, as a teacher, I should be delivering. Does any of this make sense? Yes.
So how do the poor or inequitable countries affect with education system?
So, we know from the statistics that children in poorer countries do less well in schools. So we know that. We also know from our research, CCE's research, into the learning behaviours that we talked about, that the learning behaviors of children in poorer countries are less developed. Right? And we believe, therefore, that there is a connection between the two. That the fact that their learning behaviors is less developed is why they do less well in school. My concern about children from the poorer countries is that their education systems are designed by people who are trying to replicate ideas of education which came from the developed world originally and are less focused on the needs of the children they are actually dealing with. So, a common problem in countries, in the less economically developed countries, is that there are far more languages amongst the pupils. And the response, largely speaking, in England, everybody speaks English. That's great. That people learn language best in their own language first and can then move on to learn other languages. And if you don't learn language in your own language, you learn the next language less well. Right? So it's about how you prioritize what gets taught in school, and that's a common problem in developing countries around the world. In Chile is very proud of the fact that they were a Spanish colony and most people in Chile came from Europe. And that's because the people who used to live in Chile, the Europeans murdered, so there aren't many of them left. But as a result, they want children to know about Europe and European history. So history for Chilean children is European history, largely speaking. And the Chilean children think, why am I learning the French Revolution, which happened 200 years ago in a different continent? What's it got to do with me? So it's not authentic. It's not about real world, but it's out of a political desire of politicians to go, we're Europeans and we're going to make you all Europeans. So if we teach you European history, you'll be Europeans, because that's what we believe in. And you get a lot of that in developing countries. They're simply teaching the wrong things to pupils in the wrong way. And in order to replicate a European education system, which they think is the most successful. European education system was quite successful, not terribly, but quite successful at teaching Europeans. But that doesn't mean it's going to be any good for anybody else. And the key in Thailand is what's the best education system for Thai children and Thai young people. And that shouldn't, it can learn from other people, but it shouldn't be about importing other systems into Thailand. Partly because it fails the system argument, which is it becomes another system. And education is not about systems, it's about multiplicity of systems and so forth. And therefore EF is really careful. In bringing me here, they don't want to go, oh, how do you teach people? We'll do that. They're going, no, come and challenge us about how we're doing it. Ask interesting questions about how we're doing it. Let's explore together how we're doing it and see if there are changes we need to make for Thailand because you have this other perspective, not because they're trying to adopt a system I've brought from another country.
So, in your opinion, do you think what is the weakness and strength of Thai education, and yes, and how to fix it or how to develop it?
Well, that's a big question. So far, I've only been able to interact with a fairly small amount of Thai education. I've been coming here now for about 4 or 5 years. And in that time, I've obviously worked with EEF. I've visited a few schools, but not very many. I've trained or worked with a few hundred teachers, I suppose, in that time. And that's a tiny slice of Thai education. And not enough to make big generalizations. But I have some thoughts. One activity I very often do with Thai teachers is to ask them what the purpose of school is. What's the point of school? And they have to come up with 9 purposes of school, because school's got several purposes, and they then have to rank them in order of importance, from 1 to 9. Most often, number 1 is making children happy. I have visited a very small number of Thai schools and observed the children, and they're very relaxed in the schools I've been to. I don't know how typical this is. We do a lot of work in Western Australia, in Perth, and I visited schools there, and the kids are really tense. It's extraordinary. They're just like, you just notice it immediately. It's in their bodies, and so forth. And Australian kids from Western Australia do much better academically than Thai children on things like PISA tests. And one of my questions are they too happy? Are teachers too concerned with making them happy? And is learning about being happy? Or is learning actually pretty hard and can quite often make you miserable? And should we be making them a bit more miserable if they go and learn more, if they're going to learn more? That's a thought that's crossed my mind. I find that the social relationships of children I observe are quite sophisticated. They're able to interact. I was observing a reception kindergarten class a few days ago, and the children were doing something with their hands, fun, stickers, glue, that kind of stuff. But they were talking to each other all the time and making jokes, nice jokes, about each other. I'm not sure that's the right word, but there was, in English I'd say there was a healthy banter between them. And they were 5-year-olds and 6-year-olds. They were doing this. And I thought, that's really interesting. You know, if I was in an English class of that age, children's social ability is not as good as I see in Thai children of the same age. And I think that it works up through society. You're very easy with each other on the whole. You're sophisticated socially, more so than I say the English are. We have unsophisticated social skills. So I see a mix of different things in the very few children I have studied, looked at, and the schools I've been to. But it makes me think these are issues we should think about. Social skills are really useful for learning, and if you have sophisticated social skills, but the learning's not very good. The teachers haven't learned how to use the social skills to improve the learning. How should they do that? Because you've got a real asset here. One of the great things about learning in groups is you have to negotiate truth. You're given a challenge and what's the solution, but the group has got to come up with one solution and they have to negotiate that, right? It's a very good way of learning. I think Thai children seem to have good social skills, but that's not being used to help the learning. Force it, make it difficult, get them to agree on something difficult. Like, I don't know, all sorts of difficult issues. I did a workshop once with a group of children in Australia, and they were 9 or 10. And the teacher had asked me if I would do a workshop about history, because she was teaching the history and the children were not making progress. So, as you probably know, Australia had a wonderful people living there for 50,000 years. And then the Europeans, or the British, decided to send all their prisoners to Australia. And they sent all their prisoners to Australia and they started to colonize Australia. And those prisoners were called the first fleeters because the first fleets that arrived were full of prisoners. And they were studying the first fleeters. So I said, okay, I'll do a workshop on this. So the children all arrived and we were in this big space. And I divided them into groups. And I said, right, each one of you is a tribe. And I want you to make a nice place to live. And here's some plasticine and some cardboard and various things like that. You know, like make a village or something like that where you're all going to live. So they all sat around doing that, having a wonderful time, making little houses and fish to eat and things like that. And then I said, oh, come outside, I want to discuss something with you. So they all went outside. Meanwhile, one group of children, who the other hadn't noticed, I'd kept back. And whilst the others were outside, they invaded this land they had made. And they stole the best houses and the best fish and things like that, chickens. And they carved out a big bit of land which was going to be there then, and they started living there. And I said to the children who were outside, bad news. Your land's been invaded, you better come and see. So the children all come back inside, and they're absolutely furious. They said, you can't do that, I live here, you can't, give me that back, that's mine. It's not allowed, and so on and so forth. And so big fight starts amongst the children. And I let the fight go on for a bit. And then I said, what are we going to do about it? And they said, well, we're going to kill all those people who invaded our land because they're not allowed to invade our land. And I said, well, shouldn't you sit down and talk to them about it? So they get into little groups, each one with one of these invaders. And they start having this conversation. And I'm observing one of these groups. And they have this conversation about, you're not allowed to do this. And this is my land, and why did you do it? And the invaders invent this story about they came from a land and there was a tsunami and everyone was killed and a few of them escaped on a boat and they just don't have anywhere else to live and so they came here and it's a very tragic story. And after a long time, the people whose land it was says, all right, we'll give you a little bit of land, not as much as you've taken, but we'll give you a little bit of land and we'll give you fish. And then they say, okay, that's the solution. And then the whole tribe gets together and says, look, we've got a solution, we'll give them a little bit of land. Can you vote in favour if you agree to this solution? So most of the tribe says, yes, I agree, this is a good solution. But a few of them go, I don't agree. It says, but we had a vote and it's a democracy. So we did. They said, no, this is more important. This is a matter of principle. You cannot come and steal another person's land. That's the principle. You can't negotiate on a principle. It's a principle. You're not allowed to do that. So another big argument starts about whether you can solve these things through democratic process. And but this group who won't agree refuse to agree. So the tribe vote to expel them. And they go, well, if you're going to be like that, you can't live with us anymore, so go. We're expelling you and off you go. And they all go off to a different part of the room and they start planning a re-invasion where they're going to come back and re-invade, throw everybody away and get rid of them all. So by now 3 hours had passed. This was a long workshop and they were exhausted. And I got them all together and said, you've got to go back to school now. And what do you think? And they said, this is very difficult. because the people who refused to agree were still refusing to agree and that kind of thing. But they'd had a huge argument. But now, to me, they were ready to learn Australian history because they understood what the issues were that this was really about. And the issues really mattered to them. They were connected to those issues because it was about fairness and what was fair. And now, as I said, they were ready for proper learning of the history stuff. But the passionate engagement of these children was absolutely amazing. All I did was tell them to build a nice place and then tell them their land had been invaded. Everything else they did. They took control of that whole process. I didn't do the negotiation. I didn't vote to expel some of them. The children took that whole process and took the learning on. And I think we're learning the really difficult issues about how we live together and so forth. And in Australia, it's still a big issue because they still deport all the people who try and go and live in Australia and so forth and that kind of thing. But it's putting them in those places where they have to use their social skills to address complex issues, to me is at the heart of learning. And that's what should be going on inside the classroom.
So I forgot that to ask you why you like to come to Thailand. What do you see the problems about Thai education? So what do you see? What that means? Like why you come here? What did you see about Thai education?
I think the reason that I'm here working on Thai education is because I'm really interested in EEF. It's a really interesting organization. And for me, my main interest in all the time I've been working in education is how do you improve the learning outcomes of young people from the poorest backgrounds. To me, that's the biggest question in education. Because all over the world, in every country, young people from poor backgrounds do worse in education. And because they do worse in education, they are trapped in poverty and their children will grow up poor and their children will do worse and it will continue as a cycle. And therefore, for us who are committed to trying building a more fair world, how to make young people from poor backgrounds perform better in education is the fundamental issue which all of us around the world should be facing. Because if we actually got more people better educated, then we'd have more people able to tackle global warming. Right? So poor education leads to global warming, if you see what I mean. Good education, Bill Gates has just published a book saying this. Good education will solve the problem. Good education for poor people will solve the problem. All the world's problems. So it is the number one problem. And so what brought me here is an agency specifically established to solve that one problem. And therefore, what they're doing is really interesting to me. And the conversation we can have about how to solve this problem is the most important conversation in the world.
And how to solve this problem?
That's what we're going to solve. We will solve it because they are great people. But it has to be solved in the Thai way for Thailand, if you see what I mean. And therefore it's going, yes, what can we learn from the rest of the world? But what can we do? But what can we use to make it work in Thailand? And lots of other education systems are not interested in the same problem. They're quite happy if rich people get good education. Then they have enough people, they think, well educated, and they're not concerned with the same problems and so forth. And therefore the focus of this organization is what brought me to Thailand.
So did you give them some suggestion about CCE or some from your systems to develop this?
I mean, I think
EF, yeah.
we have we've travelled the same journey together, if you see what I mean. Is that we know that if the outcomes of young people from poorer backgrounds are going to be different, teachers need to change what they're doing in the classroom, right? So we all agree that. changing a teacher is hard, but we can develop together strategies for changing teachers. The kind of learning teachers need to do in order to learn how to have a practice in the classroom which will address this challenge. Then we've been exploring how to teach teachers to do that, but it can't be that me and two people from EEF are going to go and teach them, because I don't know how many teachers there are in Thailand, but there are tens of thousands of them. So we then think, so if we're going to reach large numbers of teachers, we need to train the teacher of teachers to teach them differently, because then for each trainer we teach, we can reach thousands and so on and so forth. And then together we agree, okay, how are we going to train trainers? And then we look at different models which we pilot with different groups of teachers, with different groups of trainers of teachers, and then we watch the trainers of teachers teach teachers and see if it makes a difference to the teachers, and then change the process. So it's an ongoing conversation along that line, which we work out together.
According to COVID-19
Yes.
pandemic, so I would like to know, how do you apply your CCE with this kind of situation?
Well, there's a number of different issues there. In many countries in the world, the pandemic has led to extended closure of schools. And this has led to teachers being required to teach online. This has gone very badly around most of the world, because teaching online became having some material which I post online and the children download it and read it and then do a worksheet. And most of the research that I've seen shows that the pupils did none of it. The teachers posted, they worked very hard, but nothing came back. Sometimes the pupils tried to do it with their parents, and that was an even bigger disaster because parents learnt they were very bad teachers and it led to a lot of family fighting because parents didn't know how to do it. They always thought they did, but they didn't, and so forth. So part of what we've been doing is working with teachers about how to do successful online teaching and how you design that. And it requires very different practices from what they were doing. So for instance, relationships, your relationship with your teacher is really key to the level, to your success in learning. Right? So the question in online learning is, how are you going to maintain the relationship? Right? If you just post things online and leave them to do it, there's no relationship there at all. So a school in Norway that we worked with, which did online teaching very effectively, the head teacher said every teacher has to have a one-to-one online phone thing for 10 minutes twice a week. They just saying, how are you doing? How's life going on? One-to-one. So the child knew the relationship was continuing and they were continuing to work on the relationship. That school, all the pupils did all the work that was sent to them because the relationship was maintained. And so one of the things we talk to teachers about is those elements. You know, what are the things you need to worry about? What do you need to build into your online teaching? If you've got 35 children, you're going to talk to each one of them for 10 minutes twice a week. That's 700 minutes. That's a lot of your teaching week, right? teachers found it very hard. It meant they had to work extra hours to fit this in, but it made all the difference to the learning. And it's taking this kind of learning and applying it to what teachers do. So the online learning space needs to be thought through very carefully to include all the elements of successful teaching and learning. And I think teachers need a lot of help in terms of converting that. The second thing is that the pandemic has had a major impact on pupil well-being. And we know this all over the world. Pupils are stuck at home, they're fighting with their parents, they're having a horrible time, they don't want to do any of their schoolwork, but they feel bad because they're not doing it, and so forth. And so where school lockdown is ending, they're coming back to school, but they're not in a good state mentally. And it's really important that teachers deal with that. Don't ignore it. They're not the same children who went on the lockdown. They're different children, they're less happy children. They've got problems, right? And your teaching has to deal with that. Now, in our view, we divide well-being into two categories. One category is just feeling okay. I'm not sick, I feel happy, the weather's nice. But the other kind of well-being is called technically eudaimonic well-being. But it is the well-being you get from feeling empowered, of feeling you are the source of your own life. What you do comes from, what happens to you comes from you. Right? And this is really important in learning. That's what you have to learn. You have to learn, only you learn. No one else can learn for you. They can teach you, they can't learn for you. And the pandemic has really undermined children's sense of empowerment. You know, it was something out there that happened. And now I'm not allowed to go to school and I'm not allowed to do this and I must do this and I must do that. All the power has been taken away from them. And therefore, what teachers need to do is to make pupils feel powerful again. And it's hard to do, but it's important to do. And it can only be achieved if you, the teacher, are willing to be less powerful in order to create space for them to be more powerful. And therefore, allowing them to design their own learning. Allowing them to choose what they learn when they come back and go, okay, you've missed 4 months, you've missed so many weeks and so forth. What would you like to focus on now? Let's do that. And so they've got choice in this matter. And they go, oh, can we do some of this? Can we do some of that? And so on and so forth. So all these mechanisms for getting them to feel in control of their lives is really, really important for addressing their well-being and getting them ready for learning again.
Could you please compare Thai education with like something like animals or things or whatever you would like to compare Thai education with those things? What would it be?
I think it's very hard because I haven't seen enough of Thai education to be able to do that. What I do know, I think the thing I would say is it's probably a mistake to think in terms of Thai education being anything because it's a mix of very, very different and complicated things. It has many, many parts and they are different, and I think in addressing any issues you think there may be in Thai education, you need to be precise about what aspects. So Thai education amongst the hill tribes in the northeast is completely different from Thai education here in the centre of of Bangkok. One of the things that intrigues me, because we're going to do training for them, is that in these small rural schools in the hill tribes, all the teachers are policemen who have volunteered to do teaching because they already live there, because you can't persuade anyone else to go and live there and be teachers. And so, you know, the challenge for policemen who've been asked to be teachers because no one else will do it is completely different from the challenge of being a teacher here in Bangkok. So I think recognizing the huge complexity of Thai education, it's very, very big. You have so many schools. There's something like 70,000 schools. In England, we don't have anything like that many schools. And a huge number of your schools are tiny. And some of your schools, I discovered, have no pupils at all. And that doesn't seem to be a problem. They're still schools, don't know. But anyway, so it's about understanding the specifics. So Thai education is probably like the Thai environment. It's incredibly diverse. It has millions of different animals and creatures in it, and you need to be specific about which one you're dealing with, which ones are poisonous and which ones are tasty.
What do you think that solving education problems can help or can develop solving education system can reduce inequity education in long term?
It does it in lots of different ways. It creates a situation in young people from poorer backgrounds, develop the skills to be able to do the jobs that pay best. The world that we live in is a very, very different world, and amazing opportunities exist. In a way, the whole process of modernization and computerization and mechanization means that increasingly the really boring jobs are done by machines now. Now, that's a problem because the people who used to do the jobs don't have jobs anymore. But it does mean that we can focus on doing the jobs which pay best and are most fun. And in the modern world, those are available to everybody if they have the best ideas, because the best jobs are idea-driven. And I'll give you an example from Thailand, because I saw this on a video. It's a video about a girl who was 11 or 12 years old, who very much likes art and does this very abstract paintings. And then she had the idea that she could print those as material for dresses and other clothes. And she tried lots of material printers and eventually found one who was willing to print and market her material. And it's been hugely successful. And now she's a young teenager and she earns 1 million baht a month from the royalties from her designs. Right? Now that is turning a creative talent into real income. And you don't have to be, you don't need a university degree, you don't need to be a lawyer, you don't need to be able to do those things, and those things exist. I remember sitting next to somebody to dinner in Lithuania, where we were talking. And he was a young man. I said, "What do you do?" And he says, "Oh, I've got this company. It's an online company. And it makes me lots of money." And I said, "What does it do?" He said, "I discovered that chemistry PhDs work in laboratories and they make compounds, right? Because they're doing all this research and doing these experiments. And lots of them they try, but isn't quite what they want. And it now just sits in a test tube in their laboratory. But someone else doing some research would actually like that compound already made to mix it with something else because they've got another idea in order to do it. So I thought, oh, that's great. I will create an online site that you can list all the compounds you've got. And other people can contact you because they can search. Have you got anyone got a mixture of blah, 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 blah? You know, it's yours, 10,000 baht. And you send it to them. I said, are you a chemist? He said, no. I just had this idea. I said, I found a software designer in Morocco. A website designer in Morocco who made me a thing because they were really cheap. And they made that thing. I found in Hong Kong a company who put the money bit at the back. You know, so when you pay by your credit card and all that kind of thing. So all the money comes through and so forth. And then I went to Oxford University and I got the most famous chemist. And I said to him, look, I'm doing this website, which I think would be really useful. Can I use your photograph at the front going, this is a really useful website. And I think you should all be buying your compounds from it. And he said, yes, no, I think it would be really useful for chemists to have this. And so I was allowed to use his photograph. So if you search on him, you get my website. It says you should be buying these things and all that kind of thing. You then search on it, you think, oh yes, I will buy that one. And then you purchase it through the money machine. And I get 10% of all the sales. He says, I don't do any work anymore. Just every month, money comes into my bank account. All he had was the idea, right? And he lived in Lithuania. And he wasn't a chemist or anything else. He just had the idea. That is the reality of the world. In the old days, he said, you needed to live somewhere which had iron in the ground or coal or oil or something like that to make money, and you dig it out and sell it. He says, and then after that, you needed big complex factories to make things and that kind of thing. And they took lots of money, so you needed lots of capital. He says, nowadays, you can live anywhere and you don't need capital and you can make lots of money if you have good ideas. And we're about teaching people how to have good ideas.
So it sounds like education in school is not that important, you know. Yeah, it's like you need to learn something outside rather than in the school.
Or is school still important?
Yeah.
Learning environment is still just happen only in school?
I think that a huge amount that we are taught in schools, traditionally, we either already knew or never needed to know. Now, you went to school. Did you do maths at school? You did maths at school?
Yes.
Did you learn quadratic equations? You probably learned quadratic equations. Did you need to know about quadratic equations? And have you ever used them in your life? No. 90% of the maths curriculum is completely useless to most people. But maths professors have persuaded the government this is what we need to be learning. And this combination of what you already know and what you don't need to know dominates what goes on. So my view is, yes, you need learning environments, and schools can be great learning environments. But what we need to do is look at what are you learning in school that's really useful. And then useful for what? Now, a lot of my arguments that I've just been making is that education can provide economic success for young people. And educationists often say to me, but education is much bigger than that. It's about all these other things and so forth. And I go, yeah, I'm not saying it's the only purpose of education, but actually if you don't teach young people to be economically successful, you've betrayed them, because what quality of life are they going to have being really poor for the rest of their life? You know, money doesn't make you happy, but I can promise you not having money does make you really unhappy and so forth. And it's an element, but also I think it can teach you to find the fun jobs. I'm lucky in my life. I've always done jobs I found lots of fun and really enjoyed. And even if people stopped paying me, I didn't tell them this, but even if they stopped paying me, I would still have gone to work because it was so interesting. And that's what it should be like for all of us. And now it's potentially like that. Because the really boring jobs, as I said, we don't need to do anymore. Really, we can get machines to do them for us. So what are we going to do? We can do the fun jobs. And there's unlimited number of fun jobs to be invented.
You come here to Thailand to use a CCE to improve the Thai education or Thai student, and I wonder to know that what the method that you used to make sure that the student improve or Thai students Thai education improve.
It is PISA test is still an important factor or index that tell us that Thai students should improve or just
already success.
Yes.
Absolutely. That's a very good question. I think what I should say is right at the moment, that's what we're talking about in a year. How we should measure it, given our programs or EEF's programs. They must be specific to the programs. There must be a logic model, I think, to the measuring. That's my problem with PISA, is there's no logic model to PISA. It says we'll measure this. Oh, those people are better than those people. But what's that really telling us as an indicator of education? I think that we should be looking at have we improved the young people's capacity to learn? And then there's a big debate about how you measure that, which is the one we're having at the moment. So I wouldn't want to preempt that discussion.
You mean we have to grow or watering the growth mindset in?
Definitely. So the growth mindset is fundamentally important for Thai students. How do you measure it?
Don't really know.
And that's what we're talking about. How do you measure it?
It means the Thai student know themselves that they have a power or power for learning, right?
Yep. And how do you measure that?
By the test.
What sort of test?
Kind of test.
PISA.
But PISA doesn't give you an answer to that. PISA helps you find out how much they remembered.
Remember is different from understand.
Exactly. So how do you...
So you need to, that means you need to observe the student, right? That they improve or not by
Yes.
observing.
Observing is one of the ways you can do that. Yeah, absolutely. But I think one of the things is what you want to know is, has something changed in there? Right? We know cutting open their brain and looking doesn't tell us the answer to that question, and they die, which isn't a good result to an evaluation. That everything else is a proxy, right? PISA is a proxy for learning. Have they learned? Oh, they do this test. It doesn't tell you, it's a proxy. And all tests in this area are proxies. And that's one of the real challenges of education. In medicine, it's much easier because you go, okay, you've got this illness, I'll give you this pill, and I'll give you this one, and I'll pretend it's the pill, and then we'll see who gets better, right? But the advantage in medicine is that you're ill and you get one medicine, and you're ill and you get no medicine, and therefore if there's a difference, we know, right? In education, it's the same as you're both ill and I give you a medicine and I don't give you the medicine. But meanwhile, another 40 people give you other medicines and another 40 people give you other medicines. And then we're supposed to know what difference my medicine made. Because that's what children's lives are. Children's lives aren't neutral. They're not in a clinic. You know, they are in school. They're learning all sorts of things and their parents are teaching them or not teaching them and there's this happening and there's that happening. And anyway, children change. That's what they do. They change from one day to the next. And therefore, maybe they would have just changed anyway, and so forth. And therefore, all these proxies have huge problems methodologically as to whether they're really telling you what you think they're telling you. So that's why it takes lots of discussion to work out how we're going to measure.
บทสนทนากับคุณโพคอลลาที่คุณทันชนกศิริอนันต์จินดาและคุณนิชการภักดีทีมคอนเทนต์ของเราไปคุยมานี้เป็นภาษาอังกฤษนะครับก็ย้ำกันอีกรอบหนึ่งนะครับถ้าต้องการอ่านภาษาไทยก็สามารถเข้าไปดูได้ที่เว็บไซต์สถาบันวิจัยเพื่อความเสมอภาคทางการศึกษา research.ef.or.th ได้ด้วยนะครับเดี๋ยวเราจะแปะลิงก์เอาไว้ที่ description ไว้อีกทางหนึ่งนี่คือ Equity Voice ครับ podcast เพื่อความเสมอภาคทางการศึกษาครับคิดเห็นอย่างไรก็สามารถแลกเปลี่ยนกันได้นะครับใครมีข้อมูลอันไหนที่คิดว่าน่าคุยน่าบอกกล่าวก็สามารถมาบอกเราได้นะครับเราจะตามอ่านปรับปรุงแล้วก็ทำข้อมูลเพิ่มเติมใน EP ต่อไปวันนี้ผมโกวิท โพธิสารลาไปก่อนนะครับพบกันใหม่ EP หน้าสวัสดีครับ Equity Voice by Equity Lab สถาบันวิจัยเพื่อความเสมอภาคทางการศึกษา www.research.ef.or.th